Hi, welcome back to Introduction to Jazz Vinyl 2021. Today we're going to go way back to 2008, which is a whole different time in jazz vinyl reissues. We're going to take a look at the Analogue Productions reissue series of Blue Note records. So here's a good example. This was really like the greatest hits of Blue Note records, and you've got Dexter Gordon's Go. I'll show you some other ones here, and these were largely numbered reissues. So this one's number 452. There was a 2 subscription series. You could get the whole set, and then you could also buy them a la carte. This is the first series we're going to look at that was actually issued on 2 45 RPM records. So hold on, I'll get it. There we go. 2 45 RPM records. Why 45 RPM? Well, since this is Introduction to Jazz Vinyl, let's talk a little bit about that. According to Michael Hobson, founder of Classic Records, he was the originator of 45 RPM in this in the modern vinyl reissue series days. This is in the early 2000s, actually in the late 90s, sorry. There's a lot of competing theories on why 45 RPM is better, or if 45 RPM is better. But a couple, maybe there's like 3 families of ideas that are the basis for the rationale. One is there's just fewer tracks on the record. So if you have to split the record up into 4 sides, you don't have to cram as much onto one side. And the benefit of that is that as you get closer to the center of the record, to the label, you start to encounter something called inner groove distortion. So the closer you get to the label here, the harder it becomes for your stylus to track the grooves, because in an ideal world, your stylus sits perfectly parallel in the groove. So the tip of your stylus is perpendicular to the groove as it rides along. As you move towards the center of the label, you increase the off-kilterness of that. And also as it's going around a tighter radius there, it can cause some distortion. So it can either sound just kind of like breaking up, or like sibilant. That's noise. That's theory number 1. Theory number 2 is because you're cutting, so on a 45 RPM record, you're typically able to stay away from that label area. So you're less prone to inner groove distortion, or IGD. Idea number 2 is because you're just putting less information on the record, you can actually modulate it more. You can put bigger wiggles in because you don't need to fit as many wiggles in, and that means you can cut at a higher volume. So maybe they sound better because you can cut them louder. And in general, when you're A/Bing audio things, you need to make sure to account for differences in volume, because we tend to prefer the one that's louder. And the last one is the speed that you are spinning the record at now is significantly higher, which means that for the same event in the music, whether it takes 1 second or 1/10 of a second, on a 45 RPM record, that event is happening over a longer groove. And so the modulation of that event is more gentle as far as like a length of record groove goes for your stylus, which makes it easier to track, or you can maybe retrieve more detail. This is not settled science, however. There are plenty of audiophile people that just say that this is all kind of smoke and mirrors. But at any rate, in 2008, if you wanted to be staking a claim that you were issuing the ultimate reissue series, doing it at 45 RPM was attractive for 2 reasons. One, if there is any difference, if there is any upgrade in quality that can come from cutting at 45 RPM, now you're issuing the ultimate. The only thing you could do would be to cut at 78 RPM, but that would be kind of ridiculous because you wouldn't be able to get more than, 5 minutes on a side. So this is kind of maxed out in that regard. And at that time, a lot of record companies, they were willing to license titles to be reissued at 45 RPM when they weren't at 33 RPM. Because the 45 RPM seemed sort of like a niche product for audiophile nerds, and that was fine to kind of farm out. But if the company was also doing a reissue series itself, Blue Note Records wanted to put out their own records, they were going to do so at 33 RPM, and they didn't want to compete with a licensee. So these records were state of the 2008 art and cut at 45 RPM by a familiar name, Kevin Gray, but also cut with someone named Steve Hoffman, a very famous mastering engineer at a mastering studio called Acoustic Mastering, or ATM. So these records should all say SH and KPG. Let's see. This one says, KPG plus SH at ATM. Kevin Gray and Steve Hoffman at Acoustic Mastering. And this was the ultimate. They cut the Blue Note tapes, all analog to lacquers, and pressed these things initially at RTI, and then ultimately at a pressing plant called QRP, Quality Record Pressings, which is owned by Chad Kassem, who is the man behind the Analogue Productions label. The album covers are not great. The cover itself is actually pretty nice. It's a nice glossy photo. This photo here looks pretty sharp, but they're just in kind of like a big floppy, like extra wide hole in the album cover here. They're pretty thin, and they're really prone to coming unglued along the sides here. So every once in a while you'll get one and the whole thing's just kind of falling apart. But it's a small price to pay. Up until pretty recently, you could get these records for $50. Most of them were still in stock at Acoustic Sounds and a few other retailers. Over time, though, they've kind of most of them are gone now, especially the most sought after titles, because Blue Note reissues have had a little bit of a renaissance with the Tone Poet series, the Blue Note 80th series, and the Blue Note Classic Vinyl Reissue series has got people kind of going through the back catalog of reissues to look for some of these famous titles like Go, but that's also coming out as a Blue Note Classics series. Hank Mobley's Workout. You've got, what else do I have sitting here? Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Moanin'. So this just came out as a Blue Note Classic. And interestingly, this cover is done as the original. So the Blue Note Classic Reissue Series one uses a later cover from the 70s or late 60s. I'm not exactly sure. The other titles in this series, I mean, just really the most famous title, Something Else. This also came out as a Blue Note Classics series. I keep looking at the ends of this because these covers are also really prone to seam splits. Here's John Coltrane's Blue Train. And, okay, well, I guess I don't have any seam splits on this one. Anyhow, people love to complain about these covers, but it's uncommon to hear somebody say that they don't think these records sound great. These are kind of the gold standard in this 45 RPM release of these famous Blue Note titles. In fact, some of these titles have also been reissued at kind of ultra deluxe audiophile labels, a different one that we'll discuss in a future video. So Something Else, Moanin', Blue Train, let's see, Go was actually one of them, and Herbert Hancock's Maiden Voyage have been cut by Kevin Gray, and they've been cut at 45 for one label and 33 for another label, and people are kind of split, which one is better. So these things hold up. What has changed in the way that people want these vinyl reissues to be presented now in their platonic form really just has to do with the packaging. You don't see these covers being being included with these ultra deluxe reissues because the Tone Poet standard is the new standard, and we're actually going to see where that came from very shortly. And this is going to be the bridge here. This one's pretty interesting. Leeway, and this is right around the same time, 2008. Leeway, cut by Kevin Gray and Steve Hoffman at Acoustic Mastering at 45 RPM. We had a guest in the cutting room for this, Joe Harley, the Tone Poet. Joe Harley was working for a different label, not Analogue Productions, and there was a mix-up with which company had the rights to reissue this title, Lee Morgan's Leeway, because there were two companies doing these 45 RPM releases at the same time from Blue Note Records. And so Joe Harley showed up to master the album at the same studio that Analogue Productions was mastering all their stuff. They later realized, uh-oh, this one was supposed to go to Analogue Productions. And so they ultimately used the metalwork that Joe Harley was involved in creating on this Analogue Productions 45 RPM reissue of Leeway. Eventually, the company that Joe Harley was working with did re-release Leeway on 33 RPM several years later, and we'll get into that area of modern vinyl reissue history in the very next video here with the long-awaited, if you know a little bit about these jazz vinyl reissues, kind of the series that has given rise to what the Tone Poet standard is, the gatefold jackets, the mastering by Kevin Gray, the whole thing, both sonically, like Analogue Productions, but also the packaging that's come to be expected now, was developed by Music Matters. Two people, Ron Rombach and Joe Harley, the Tone Poet. And that's coming up in the very next video. Thanks for watching.